Sarah, we need to talk. My daughter Emma burst through my front door without knocking, her 3-year-old Mason clinging to her leg while 2-year-old Lily wailed in her arms. Behind her, my son David pushed through with his twin boys, 4-year-old Jake and Ethan, both sticky with what appeared to be chocolate and grape juice. The invasion of my peaceful Sunday morning felt like a coordinated attack, and as I watched my carefully organized living room transform into chaos within seconds, I had no idea this moment would lead to the most liberating decision of my 64-year-old life. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning had started beautifully. I'd been sitting in my sunroom with fresh coffee and the Sunday crossword puzzle, watching cardinals at my bird feeder through the large windows that overlooked my garden. At 64, I'd finally reached the phase of life I'd been dreaming about since my husband Robert passed 3 years ago. The mortgage was paid off, my retirement savings were solid, and for the first time in decades, my weekends belonged entirely to me. My name is Sarah Chen, and I'd spent 30 years as a high school mathematics teacher before retiring 2 years ago. Robert and I had raised Emma and David in this same house in suburban Minneapolis, watching them grow from demanding toddlers into what I'd hoped would become considerate adults. We'd sacrificed family vacations to pay for their college educations, postponed home improvements to fund their weddings, and dipped into our retirement savings more than once to help them through various financial crises. Emma worked part-time as a dental hygienist, while David managed a local sporting goods store. Both had married young and started families immediately, seemingly without considering the financial implications. Emma's husband Marcus traveled constantly for his sales job, leaving her overwhelmed with 2 small children. David's wife Jennifer had returned to work after maternity leave but struggled with the cost of daycare for the twins. The pattern had started innocently enough 6 months ago. Emma had called on a Friday afternoon, voice strained with exhaustion. "Mom, Marcus is flying out to Denver for a conference this weekend, and I haven't slept more than 3 hours straight in weeks. Could you possibly watch Mason and Lily on Saturday? Just for a few hours so I can catch up on sleep, and maybe do some grocery shopping without 2 screaming kids in tow." Of course I'd agreed. What grandmother wouldn't want to help her daughter during a difficult time? Mason and Lily were adorable when they weren't having meltdowns, and I enjoyed reading them stories and playing simple games. That first Saturday had been manageable, even pleasant. The following weekend, David had called with a similar request. Jennifer's sister was getting married in Chicago, and they desperately needed someone to watch Jake and Ethan overnight. The wedding was adults only, and hotel babysitting services were expensive. Could I help them out, just this once? Again I'd said yes. The boys were energetic but well-behaved, and we'd had fun building elaborate block towers and watching animated movies. I'd tucked them into the guest room beds with stories about their grandfather, feeling useful and needed, but somehow, those isolated requests had evolved into an expectation. Every Friday, either Emma or David would call with weekend plans that required my babysitting services. Emma needed date nights to save her marriage. David and Jennifer deserved weekend getaways after working all week. The children needed consistent care from someone who loved them unconditionally. The requests had become demands, and the demands had become assumptions. Last weekend, Emma had simply texted me Friday evening, dropping the kids off at 8 a.m. Saturday. "Back Sunday night. Thanks, Mom." No question mark, no please, no acknowledgement that I might have other plans. When I'd called to explain that I'd already committed to helping my neighbor Helen move some furniture, Emma's response had been sharp with frustration. "Mom, we're counting on you. Marcus already booked the hotel for our anniversary weekend. Can't Helen find someone else to help her move a couch?" I'd canceled my plans with Helen and spent the weekend managing 2 tired, cranky toddlers who missed their parents, and didn't understand why Grandma seemed less patient than usual. By Sunday evening, my back ached from constantly bending to pick up toys and children, my head pounded from the non-stop noise, and my carefully maintained house looked like a tornado had swept through it. Standing in my living room now, watching Emma deposit Lily on my sofa without removing her muddy shoes, while David directed his boys toward my kitchen like they owned the place, I felt something shift inside my chest. The assumption that my time, my space and my energy were available on demand had crossed a line I hadn't even realized existed. Mom, we've been talking, and we think it's time to formalize this arrangement. Emma settled herself into my favorite armchair while bouncing Lily on her knee. David nodded from the kitchen doorway, already opening my refrigerator and pulling out juice boxes I'd apparently been expected to stock. What kind of arrangement? I asked, though something in their coordinated approach told me I wasn't going to like the answer. Well, Marcus got promoted, which means more travel. And Jennifer wants to go back to school for her nursing degree, which means weekend study groups. Emma's tone carried the authority of someone presenting a logical business proposal. We need reliable childcare every weekend, Friday evening through Sunday night. David stepped into the living room, a juice box in each hand for his boys who were already pulling books off my carefully organized shelves. Mom, you're retired, you have the time and the space, and the kids love being here. It makes perfect sense. The words hit me like cold water. Not a request for help during a difficult period, but a permanent rearrangement of my life to accommodate their choices. Not gratitude for past assistance, but entitlement to future service. What about compensation? I asked, curious to see how far their sense of entitlement extended. Emma laughed, the sound containing no humor. Mom, these are your grandchildren. Family helps family. Besides, think about all the money Dad left you when he died. It's not like you need the income. The casual reference to Robert's life insurance payout, money I'd carefully invested for my own future security, crystallized something cold and determined in my stomach. They saw me not as a person with my own needs and desires, but as a resource to be utilized for their convenience. David sat on my sofa without being invited, his muddy work boots propped on my coffee table. We've already adjusted our schedules around this. Mom enrolled the kids in swimming lessons on Saturday mornings, and I signed the twins up for soccer on Sunday afternoons. We figured you could handle the transportation since you don't work anymore. They'd planned my weekends without consulting me, committed my time and energy without my consent, and were now informing me of decisions they'd made about my life. The audacity was breathtaking, but what struck me more profoundly was the complete absence of consideration for my own wants or needs. I need to think about this. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. This is a significant commitment you're asking for. There's nothing to think about, Emma said, her patience clearly wearing thin. Mom, we're not asking you to climb Mount Everest. We're asking you to spend time with your grandchildren. Most grandmothers would be thrilled for the opportunity. The emotional manipulation was expertly delivered, designed to make me feel selfish for hesitating to surrender my weekends permanently. But instead of guilt, I felt a clarity I hadn't experienced in months. Actually, I do need to think about it. And right now, I need some quiet time in my own home. Emma's expression shifted from confident expectation to surprised irritation. What's that supposed to mean? It means I'd like you to take the children home, so I can process what you've just proposed. David looked genuinely confused. Mom, it's Sunday. We always stay for dinner on Sundays. Jennifer's expecting me home around 8. The assumption that my Sunday dinner invitation was a permanent fixture, not a gesture of hospitality I could withdraw, added another layer to my growing frustration. I walked to my front closet and pulled out their coats. Not today. I need some space to think clearly about this weekend commitment you're proposing. Emma's face flushed red. Are you seriously kicking us out? Your own children and grandchildren. I'm asking you to respect my need for quiet time in my own home. That's not unreasonable. The children, sensing adult tension, began gathering their scattered toys with the efficiency of frequent visitors. Mason looked up at me with concerned eyes. Grandma Sarah, are you mad at Mommy? The innocent question pierced my heart. I knelt beside him, smoothing his dark hair. I'm not mad, sweetheart. Grandma just needs some quiet time to think about grown-up things. After they left, the silence in my house felt profound. I walked through rooms that showed evidence of the invasion. Couch cushions askew, toys scattered across the floor, sticky fingerprints on my windows, and an empty refrigerator where my weekend groceries had been consumed without thought or gratitude. Sitting back in my sunroom with a fresh cup of coffee, I realized this moment represented a crossroads. I could accept their demands and spend the next decade of my life providing free childcare every weekend, watching my own dreams and plans disappear under the weight of their expectations. Or I could reclaim my autonomy and deal with whatever family consequences followed. The decision, when it came, arrived with surprising clarity. I pulled out my laptop and opened a travel website I'd bookmarked months ago, but never seriously explored. The page showed a luxury cruise line offering extended voyages for mature travelers, 3-month European tours, 6-month world cruises, even year-long adventures for people who wanted to see everything and had the time to do it properly. My finger hovered over a link labeled 12-month global discovery voyage, as an idea formed that was both terrifying and exhilarating. If Emma and David wanted to treat my time as infinitely available for their convenience, perhaps they needed to learn what unavailable actually looked like. Monday morning brought the inevitable phone calls. Emma first, her voice tight with lingering irritation from yesterday's conversation. "Mom, I hope you've thought about our talk and realized we're just trying to include you in the children's lives in a meaningful way. I've been thinking quite a lot actually, and I've made a decision that I think will provide clarity for all of us." "Great, so you'll take the kids this weekend. Marcus needs to leave Friday morning for a conference in Seattle, and I really need the break. Actually, I won't be available for childcare this weekend, or any weekend for the next year." The silence stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. "Mom, what are you talking about?" "I'm taking a cruise, a year-long cruise that visits 6 continents and 47 countries. I leave in 3 weeks." Another long silence, followed by a sound that might have been choking. "A year? Mom, you can't be serious. What about the kids? What about our jobs? What about the childcare arrangement we discussed? The arrangement you announced without consulting me." I kept my voice pleasant but firm. "I never agreed to provide every weekend childcare. You informed me that you'd already made plans based on that assumption." "But Mom," Emma's voice rose to a pitch I recognized from her teenage years, "you're our only option. Daycare centers don't do overnight weekend care, and babysitters are expensive. We're counting on you. Perhaps you should have consulted with me before you started counting on me." David called 20 minutes later, his approach more aggressive than his sister's emotional manipulation. "Mom, Emma says you're threatening to abandon your grandchildren to go on some cruise. That's the most selfish thing I've ever heard."
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
"I'm not abandoning anyone. I'm taking a vacation that I've earned and can afford. Your children have 2 parents who are fully capable of caring for them, not on weekends. Our whole schedule depends on weekend childcare. Jennifer starts her nursing program next month, and I pick up extra shifts on Saturdays to help pay for it. Those sound like choices you made without considering whether your support system was actually available to support them." The conversation deteriorated from there, with David accusing me of being vindictive and manipulative, using my grandchildren as pawns in some power game. When I calmly explained that I'd simply decided to prioritize my own needs for once in my life, he hung up on me. By Wednesday, the family pressure campaign had intensified. Jennifer called, crying about how her dreams of becoming a nurse would be destroyed if I didn't provide weekend childcare. Marcus sent lengthy text messages about the strain my selfishness was putting on his marriage. Even my own sister Linda called, having been recruited by Emma to talk sense into me. "Sarah, honey," Linda said in the tone she'd used when we were teenagers and she thought I was making a mistake, "don't you think a year-long cruise is a bit extreme? Couldn't you work out some kind of compromise with the kids?" "What kind of compromise would you suggest?" I asked. "Half my weekends, 3 weekends a month. How much of my retirement should I sacrifice to accommodate their poor planning?" "Well, when you put it that way it sounds harsh, but they are family, and those grandchildren need their grandmother. They have their grandmother. They'll continue to have their grandmother when I return from my cruise. What they won't have is a grandmother who provides free childcare on demand without being consulted about her availability or appreciated for her efforts." That evening, I received an unexpected visitor. Helen Foster, my neighbor and closest friend, knocked on my door carrying a bottle of wine and wearing a grin that suggested she'd heard about my family drama through the neighborhood grapevine. Helen was my age, but had never married or had children, spending her career as a travel writer for various magazines. She'd circled the globe 3 times, spoke 4 languages, and had stories about adventures in places I'd only dreamed of visiting. "So," she said, settling into my kitchen with 2 wine glasses, "I hear you're planning to join the ranks of rebellious grandmothers who refuse to be taken for granted. Is that what I'm doing?" Helen laughed, a sound full of admiration. "Darling, You're doing exactly what every woman our age should do when her family starts treating her like unpaid help instead of a human being with her own dreams and desires. We talked late into the night about travel, about independence, about the guilt that society heaped on women who dared to prioritize their own happiness. Helen shared stories about cruise passengers she'd met, women in their 60s and 70s who discovered freedom and adventure after decades of putting everyone else first. The cruise you're looking at is magnificent, she told me. I sailed the first leg of that itinerary 2 years ago. The ship is like a floating city, with lectures and classes and entertainment. You'll meet incredible people and see places that will change your perspective on everything. By the time Helen left, my decision had crystallized from impulse into determined resolution. I pulled out my credit card and booked passage on the Global Discovery voyage, departing in 3 weeks from Fort Lauderdale. The cost was significant but well within my means, and the feeling of liberation that washed over me when I clicked the final confirmation button was worth every penny. The next morning brought another family summit. Emma and David arrived together, this time without the children, their expressions grim with determined confrontation. They settled into my living room like attorneys preparing to deliver an ultimatum. "Mom, we've been talking to other family members," Emma began, her tone suggesting she'd prepared this speech carefully. "Everyone agrees that this cruise idea is a cry for help. You're obviously depressed about Dad's death and making impulsive decisions that you'll regret." The amateur psychology irritated me more than their previous demands. "I'm not depressed, and this isn't impulsive. I've been thinking about traveling for years. Your father and I always planned to see the world together after retirement, but his heart attack changed those plans." David leaned forward, his expression softening slightly. "Mom, we understand that you miss Dad, but running away on a cruise isn't going to bring him back. And it's definitely not going to solve the family problems you're creating. I'm not running away from anything. I'm running toward something, toward experiences and adventures I've postponed for decades while taking care of other people's needs." Emma's patient facade cracked. "What about our needs? What about your grandchildren's needs? How can you be so selfish?" The word hung in the air between us, loaded with decades of conditioning that told women their own desires were inherently selfish while everyone else's needs were legitimate priorities. "Let me ask you something," I said, surprising myself with the steadiness of my voice. "When was the last time either of you asked about my needs? When was the last time you inquired about my dreams or interests, or how I'd like to spend my time?" They exchanged glances that confirmed what I'd suspected. My needs had become invisible to them, relevant only when they conflicted with their convenience. "We assumed you were happy babysitting," David said defensively. "You never complained, you always seemed to enjoy spending time with the kids." "I do enjoy spending time with my grandchildren. What I don't enjoy is having my time demanded without consultation, my space invaded without permission, and my generosity taken for granted without appreciation." Emma stood up abruptly, her composure finally shattering completely. "Fine, go on your selfish cruise. But don't expect us to welcome you back with open arms when you realize what you've thrown away. And don't expect us to bring the children around someone who clearly doesn't prioritize family." The threat was designed to wound, to make me choose between my autonomy and access to my grandchildren. But instead of the intended fear, I felt a calm certainty that this manipulation needed to end. "Emma, if you use my grandchildren as weapons to control my behavior, you'll discover that I'm stronger than you think. I raised 2 children, built a career, and managed a household for 30 years. I'm perfectly capable of living an independent life." After they left, slamming my door with the same dramatic flair Emma had perfected as a teenager, I sat in my quiet house and felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Peace, not the temporary calm between crises, but the deep peace of having taken control of my own life. The cruise departure was still 2 weeks away, but the psychological journey had already begun. I was no longer a resource to be utilized, but a person with agency and choices. The family drama would continue, I was certain, but it would continue without my participation in the manipulation. That afternoon, I called Helen and asked if she'd like to help me shop for cruise clothing. As we drove toward the mall, I realized this story was just beginning. The real adventure wouldn't start when the ship left port, but had already begun the moment I decided that my own happiness mattered as much as anyone else's convenience. 2 weeks before my departure date, the family warfare escalated in ways I hadn't anticipated. Emma appeared at my front door on Tuesday morning, with all 4 grandchildren in tow, their overnight bags suggesting this wasn't a social visit. "We're moving in with you until you come to your senses about this ridiculous cruise," she announced, pushing past me into my foyer, while the children scattered through my house like they'd been released from captivity. "Marcus thinks I'm having a nervous breakdown over your abandonment, and David's marriage is falling apart because Jennifer can't handle weekend childcare arrangements." The manipulation was breathtaking in its audacity. By framing my travel plans as abandonment and positioning herself as the victim of my selfishness, Emma was attempting to guilt me into canceling the cruise through the presence of my grandchildren. Mason and Lily immediately began pulling toys from the bag Emma had dropped in my living room, while Jake and Ethan headed straight for my kitchen, opening cabinets with the familiarity of frequent visitors. The chaos that erupted in my carefully maintained home felt like an invasion designed to wear down my resistance through sheer exhaustion. "Emma, you can't simply move into my house without discussing it first." I kept my voice calm despite the anger building in my chest. "I have plans for the next 2 weeks, preparations to make for my trip." "Your trip is the problem, Mom." She settled into my favorite armchair with the confidence of someone who expected to be accommodated indefinitely. "These children need stability, not a grandmother who's selfishly gallivanting around the world while her family falls apart." The calculated cruelty of using my grandchildren as emotional hostages crystallized something cold and determined in my resolve. Emma had crossed a line from manipulation into something approaching psychological warfare, and I realized that backing down now would establish a precedent that would haunt the rest of my life. David arrived an hour later with his own overnight bag, explaining that Jennifer had locked him out of their house after he'd suggested they find alternative childcare arrangements for her nursing school schedule. His presence turned my peaceful home into a refugee camp for adults who refused to take responsibility for their own poor planning. "Mom, you have to understand," David said, settling onto my couch without invitation while his twins used my coffee table as a jungle gym. "We've built our entire lives around the assumption that you'd be available for childcare. You can't just change the rules in the middle of the game. I never agreed to play this game in the first place. You both made assumptions about my availability without consulting me. Now you're dealing with the consequences of those assumptions." Emma looked up from her phone where she'd been typing furiously, probably updating social media about her mother's cruel abandonment. "The consequences aren't just ours, Mom. These children are suffering because their grandmother cares more about cruise ship buffets than family obligations." The emotional manipulation was expertly crafted to trigger the guilt that had controlled my decisions for decades. But instead of the intended shame, I felt a clarity that surprised me with its intensity. Emma and David had learned to use my love for my grandchildren as a weapon against my autonomy, and that manipulation needed to end. I walked to my hall closet and retrieved their coats. "Everyone needs to leave now. This conversation is over." "Mom, you can't kick out your own grandchildren," David protested, but his voice carried uncertainty. He'd never seen me establish boundaries this firmly before. "I'm not kicking out my grandchildren. I'm removing manipulative adults who are using innocent children as pawns in their emotional games." The scene that followed tested every ounce of determination I possessed. Mason began crying when Emma told him they had to leave Grandma Sarah's house because Grandma was being mean to Mommy. Lily clung to my legs, asking in her small voice why I was sending them away. Jake and Ethan looked confused and frightened by the adult tension they couldn't understand. But through the emotional chaos, I held firm to my decision. These children deserved parents who took responsibility for their own choices, instead of manipulating elderly relatives into providing free services. My temporary firmness might cause them momentary confusion, but my long-term capitulation would teach them that manipulation was an acceptable way to control other people. After they left, my house felt eerily quiet. I walked through rooms that showed evidence of the brief invasion, straightening cushions and returning toys to their proper places. The silence that followed felt profound, like the calm after a storm that had been building for months. My phone rang constantly over the next few days. Marcus called to explain how Emma's stress over my abandonment was affecting their marriage. Jennifer sobbed through a voicemail about how her dreams of becoming a nurse were being destroyed by my selfishness. Even my elderly Aunt Rose, who lived in Denver and barely spoke to our family, called to express disappointment in my priorities. The coordinated campaign told me everything I needed to know about Emma and David's desperation. They'd enlisted every family member and friend they could think of to pressure me into canceling my cruise. The effort they expended trying to manipulate me could have been used to find actual solutions to their childcare needs. Linda called again on Thursday, her tone more concerned than confrontational. "Sarah, I've been thinking about our last conversation, and I'm starting to wonder if there's more to this story than Emma and David are telling me." "What do you mean?" "Well, when I was raising my kids, I never expected Mom to provide regular childcare. And when I did ask for help, I made sure to ask, not demand. Some of the things Emma's been saying about your obligations to provide weekend babysitting sound pretty entitled." The validation from my sister meant more than I'd expected. Linda had always been the diplomatic one in our family, skilled at seeing multiple perspectives in family conflicts. If she was questioning Emma and David's narrative, other relatives might be having similar doubts. "Linda, can I ask you something? When you were working and raising children, how did you handle weekend childcare needs?" "We planned ahead, saved money for babysitters, and occasionally asked Mom for help with specific events. But we never assumed she was available every weekend. That would have been presumptuous." That's exactly what Emma and David have been doing. They've restructured their entire lives around the assumption that I'll provide free weekend childcare without consulting me about my availability or acknowledging the sacrifice it requires. Our conversation lasted 2 hours, with Linda gradually understanding the full scope of the manipulation I'd been experiencing. By the time we hung up, she'd agreed to help deflect some of the family pressure and encouraged me to follow through with my travel plans. Friday brought an unexpected ally. Tyler Martinez, my next-door neighbor's college-age son who'd been helping with my yard work since high school, knocked on my door with a proposition that caught me completely off guard. "Mrs. Chen, I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that you're planning a big cruise and your family's giving you grief about it. I wanted you to know that I think it's awesome." Tyler was 22, a business major at the University of Minnesota who'd always impressed me with his maturity and work ethic. He'd been accepted to graduate school but was taking a gap year to save money and gain work experience. "I also wanted to ask if you'd consider letting me house sit while you're gone. I could maintain the yard, handle any maintenance issues, and keep an eye on things for security. Mom mentioned that you were worried about leaving the house empty for so long." The offer solved a problem I'd been anxious about. My house was my largest asset, and leaving it vacant for a year posed security risks I hadn't fully addressed. Having Tyler, whom I'd known and trusted since he was in high school, maintain the property would provide peace of mind I hadn't expected to find. "What kind of arrangement are you thinking about?" I asked, genuinely curious about his proposal. "I could live here rent-free in exchange for property maintenance and security. I'd keep up the yard work, handle small repairs, and make sure everything stays in good condition. I'm starting graduate school in the fall, so having a quiet place to study would be perfect for both of us." The arrangement felt like providence. Tyler was responsible, trustworthy, and familiar with my property maintenance needs. His presence would also make it impossible for Emma and David to claim I was abandoning my responsibilities as a homeowner. We spent the afternoon working out the details of our agreement. Tyler would move in the day before my departure and handle everything from lawn care to snow removal. He'd forward my mail, maintain contact with my insurance company, and send me weekly updates about the property's condition. More importantly, his presence meant that Emma and David couldn't use my empty house as an emotional manipulation tool, claiming I'd abandoned not just my family but my entire life in Minneapolis. That evening, I called Helen to update her on the latest family drama and my arrangement with Tyler. Her response was immediate and supportive. "Darling, you've just discovered what every woman our age needs to learn. Standing up to manipulative family members requires tactical planning and strategic alliances. You're handling this beautifully. Do you think I'm being too harsh?" The guilt was still there, despite my resolution. These were my children, and part of me wondered if I should find some compromise that preserved family harmony. Helen's laugh carried decades of wisdom about family dynamics. "Sarah, harsh would be cutting them off permanently without explanation. What you're doing is setting boundaries that should have been established years ago. They're adults with their own families, and it's time they learn to manage their responsibilities without exploiting your generosity. We talked about the psychological patterns that trapped grandmothers in unpaid childcare arrangements, the cultural expectations that positioned women's retirement years as available for family service rather than personal fulfillment. Helen shared stories about friends who'd sacrificed their own dreams to provide endless grandchild care, only to discover that their generosity was taken for granted rather than appreciated. The weekend before my departure brought one final confrontation. Emma and David arrived together on Saturday morning with what they clearly considered their ultimate weapon, all four grandchildren, dressed in their most adorable outfits and coached to deliver heartbreaking pleas for me to cancel my trip. Grandma Sarah, Mason said, his little face serious with the weight of adult instruction, "Mommy says you're going away for a really long time and we might not see you ever again." The manipulation through innocent children's voices was expertly crafted to shatter my resolve. Emma and David stood behind them, their expressions carefully neutral, allowing the children's coached words to carry their emotional attack. I knelt down to Mason's eye level, my heart breaking for the confusion and fear these adults had instilled in their children. "Sweetheart, Grandma is going on a big adventure to see beautiful places all around the world. I'll be gone for a year, and then I'll come back with lots of pictures and stories to share with you. But what if something bad happens to you?" Lily asked, her eyes wide with worry but no 4-year-old should have to carry. The question revealed the depth of Emma and David's psychological manipulation. They'd frightened their own children with scenarios of permanent loss and abandonment to pressure me into canceling my trip. "Nothing bad is going to happen to me, sweetheart. I'll be on a big safe ship with doctors and nurses and lots of other people who are taking the same adventure. And I'll send you postcards from every country I visit so you can see all the amazing places Grandma gets to explore." Jake, clearly coached for this moment, stepped forward with tears in his eyes. "But Grandma, who's going to take care of us on weekends when Mommy and Daddy have to work?" The question crystallized everything wrong with this situation. These children had been taught that their care was my responsibility rather than their parents' obligation. Emma and David had used their own children as weapons in their manipulation campaign, while simultaneously failing to prepare them for the reality that grandparents weren't substitute parents. "Your mommies and daddies are going to take care of you, just like mommies and daddies are supposed to do. That's their job, and they love you very much." Emma stepped forward, her mask of maternal concern slipping to reveal the anger beneath. "Mom, you're confusing them. We've explained that family members help each other, and right now they need their grandmother's help. And I've helped for months without being asked if I wanted to help or appreciated for the sacrifice it required. Now I'm choosing to help myself to the retirement I've earned." David moved closer, his presence intended to intimidate through physical proximity. "Mom, if you get on that cruise ship, don't expect us to be here when you get back. We'll find our own solutions to our problems, and they won't include a grandmother who puts her own pleasure ahead of her family's needs." The threat was designed to force me to choose between my autonomy and my relationship with my grandchildren. But the ultimatum revealed everything I needed to know about Emma and David's character. They were willing to use their children as collateral damage in their manipulation campaign. "David, if you want to punish your children for your mother's independence, that's your choice. But understand that you'll be destroying their relationship with someone who loves them unconditionally because you're angry that I won't provide free childcare on demand." The conversation deteriorated from there, with Emma accusing me of being a narcissist who cared only about myself, and David threatening to ensure that other family members knew about my selfishness. The children, sensing the adult anger they couldn't understand, began crying in confusion and fear. When they finally left, dragging sobbing children who didn't understand why the adults in their lives were so angry with each other, I sat in my quiet house and felt something unexpected. Relief. The confrontation had shown me exactly who Emma and David had become as adults, and the knowledge, while painful, was also liberating. These weren't people who deserved to control my choices through guilt and manipulation. They were adults who'd learned to use emotional weapons to avoid taking responsibility for their own decisions. My refusal to enable their behavior might temporarily disrupt their plans, but it might also force them to develop the maturity they should have acquired years ago. Sunday morning brought a knock on my door from an unexpected visitor. Jennifer stood on my porch alone, without the children, her expression suggesting she'd come to have a conversation very different from the ones Emma and David had been orchestrating. "Mrs. Chen, I hope you don't mind me stopping by. I wanted to talk to you privately about this whole situation." Jennifer had always been the most reasonable of my children's spouses, less prone to drama and manipulation than Marcus or my own children. I invited her in and offered coffee, curious about her perspective on the family crisis. "I owe you an apology," she said, settling into my kitchen with obvious discomfort. "David's been telling me that you agreed to provide weekend childcare for the indefinite future, and I based my nursing school decisions on that assumption. But after talking to Linda yesterday, I'm realizing that maybe David misrepresented your agreement to help occasionally." The conversation that followed revealed the extent of David's deception. He'd told Jennifer that I'd volunteered to provide regular weekend childcare and was excited about the opportunity to spend more time with my grandchildren. He'd presented my reluctant agreement to occasional help as enthusiastic commitment to ongoing service. "Jennifer, I love spending time with Jake and Ethan, but I never agreed to provide childcare every weekend for the next several years. David asked for help with specific situations, and I said yes because I wanted to support your family during difficult transitions." She looked genuinely shocked. "He told me you offered to take them every weekend so I could focus on school without worrying about childcare costs. Did he also mention that I was never consulted about my availability, never thanked for the time and energy I provided, and never asked if this arrangement was sustainable for me?" The questions seemed to crystallize realizations Jennifer had been avoiding. Her expression shifted from confusion to embarrassment to anger as she processed the implications of David's lies. "Mrs. Chen, I'm so sorry. I had no idea you felt taken advantage of. If I'd known you were providing childcare reluctantly, I would have made different arrangements for school. You're not responsible for David's misrepresentations, but I appreciate your apology. The truth is, I've been looking forward to traveling for years, and I finally have the health and resources to make it happen." Our conversation continued for over an hour, with Jennifer gradually understanding the full scope of the manipulation that had been occurring. She revealed that she'd been uncomfortable with the assumption that I'd provide free weekend childcare, but had been told by David that I'd requested the opportunity. By the time she left, Jennifer had committed to finding alternative childcare arrangements for her nursing school schedule and supporting my right to travel during my retirement. More importantly, she'd agreed to help maintain my relationship with Jake and Ethan regardless of David's reaction to my cruise. That afternoon, I received a phone call that changed everything. Marcus called, but instead of the accusatory tone I'd expected, his voice carried genuine concern and confusion. "Mrs. Chen, I need to ask you something directly, and I hope you'll be honest with me. Emma's been saying that you volunteered to provide regular childcare for Mason and Lily, but some of the things she's told me don't add up." The conversation revealed another layer of deception. Marcus had been told that I'd offered to take the children every weekend because I was lonely after Robert's death and needed the company. Emma had presented my reluctant compliance as enthusiastic volunteering, making Marcus believe I was benefiting from the arrangement as much as their family was. When I explained the reality of how the weekend childcare had evolved from occasional help to demanded service, Marcus was quiet for a long time. "Mrs. Chen, I owe you a huge apology. I thought you were backing out of a commitment you'd made willingly. I didn't realize Emma had been pressuring you into providing free childcare." Marcus had always been more reasonable than Emma, but I'd assumed he was complicit in the manipulation campaign. Learning that he'd been deceived about my willingness to provide childcare cast the entire family drama in a different light. "Emma's been under a lot of stress with my travel schedule, and I think she convinced herself that you wanted to help more than you actually did. But using the kids to guilt you into canceling your cruise was wrong, and I'm going to put a stop to it." The phone call ended with Marcus promising to find alternative childcare arrangements and apologizing for Emma's manipulation tactics. He also expressed genuine enthusiasm about my cruise plans, admitting that he'd been encouraging Emma to find her own adventures and interests instead of depending on family members for childcare services. Monday morning, 5 days before my departure, brought the resolution I hadn't dared to hope for. Emma called, her voice subdued and lacking the righteous anger that had characterized our recent conversations. "Mom, I need to apologize. Marcus and I had a long talk yesterday, and he helped me see that I've been treating you unfairly." The conversation that followed revealed the psychological pressure Emma had been experiencing. Marcus's frequent travel had left her feeling overwhelmed and isolated, and she'd begun viewing my weekend childcare as the only thing that made her life manageable. But instead of addressing her marriage's structural problems or finding sustainable childcare solutions, she'd convinced herself that I'd volunteered for permanent weekend service and had become increasingly resentful when I'd shown signs of reluctance. "I don't want you to cancel your cruise, Mom. You deserve to see the world and have adventures. I was scared that if you left, I wouldn't be able to manage everything on my own." The honesty in her voice felt genuine, lacking the calculated manipulation that had characterized our recent interactions. Emma was finally acknowledging that her fear of independence had driven her to exploit my generosity rather than develop her own coping strategies. We talked for over an hour about practical solutions to her childcare needs, financial strategies for affording professional services, and ways to restructure her life to be less dependent on external support. By the time we hung up, Emma had committed to apologizing to the children for frightening them about my cruise and supporting my travel plans. The transformation from family crisis to family support happened with startling speed once the truth replaced manipulation. David called that afternoon with his own apology, admitting that his marriage problems had made him desperate for any solution that didn't require him to change his own behavior or spending patterns. Jennifer had helped him understand that expecting me to provide free childcare indefinitely was unreasonable and unfair, especially when I'd never been consulted about the long-term arrangement he'd assumed I'd accepted. By Wednesday, 2 days before my departure, the family dynamic had shifted completely. Instead of pressure to cancel my cruise, I received offers to drive me to the airport and help with last-minute preparations. Emma brought the children for a proper goodbye visit, with no manipulation or guilt-inducing scenarios. We looked at maps together, and I showed them pictures of the countries I'd be visiting. The children were excited about receiving postcards from different places, and their enthusiasm felt genuine rather than coached. Tyler moved into my house on Thursday, and we spent the evening reviewing property maintenance schedules and emergency contact information. His presence made my departure feel secure rather than reckless, and his excitement about the house-sitting arrangement confirmed that our agreement would benefit both of us. Friday morning brought Helen to drive me to the airport, along with a small gathering of neighbors and friends who'd gathered to send me off on my adventure. The contrast with the family warfare that had raged just weeks earlier was profound. As we drove toward the airport, Helen shared wisdom that felt like a benediction on the journey I was beginning.
"Sarah, you've just learned one of life's most important lessons. The people who truly love you will support your happiness even when it inconveniences them. The people who try to control you through guilt and manipulation reveal more about their own character than yours." Sitting in the departure lounge waiting for my flight to Fort Lauderdale where the cruise ship waited, I reflected on the transformation that had occurred. Standing up to manipulation hadn't destroyed my family relationships, it had revealed which relationships were worth preserving and which ones needed fundamental restructuring. The year ahead promised adventures I'd dreamed about for decades, but the real journey had already begun with the decision to prioritize my own happiness after years of putting everyone else's convenience first. As my flight began boarding, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Anticipation for a future that belonged entirely to me, shaped by my own choices rather than other people's demands. The adventure was finally beginning. The Global Discovery departed Fort Lauderdale on a crystalline morning in early March, and as I stood on the deck watching the Florida coastline disappear into the Atlantic horizon, I felt a freedom I hadn't experienced since before my children were born. The ship was magnificent, a floating city with elegant restaurants, lecture halls, libraries, and observation decks that promised adventures I'd only dreamed about during decades of putting everyone else's needs before my own. My stateroom was compact but beautifully appointed, with a private balcony that would become my favorite retreat during the year ahead. The first few days were devoted to orientation, meeting fellow passengers, and adjusting to the rhythm of shipboard life. The demographics surprised me initially, with passengers ranging from their 50s to their 80s, all seeking the same thing: experiences they'd postponed while managing careers, raising families, and caring for aging parents. Among my table mates in the dining room was Margaret Walsh, a retired librarian from Boston, whose husband had died 2 years earlier, leaving her with comfortable savings and no one to answer to for the first time in her adult life. Dorothy Kim, a former pediatrician from Seattle, had sold her practice and boarded the cruise the day after her youngest child graduated from medical school. Frank Morrison, a widowed contractor from Denver, had spent 40 years building other people's dream homes and decided it was time to see dream destinations for himself. The conversations during those first dinners revealed a common thread among the passengers. We were all people who'd reached a point in our lives where we'd stopped waiting for permission to pursue our own happiness. The stories we shared about family resistance to our travel plans were remarkably similar, suggesting that adult children's sense of entitlement to their parents' time and resources was more widespread than I'd realized. Margaret's daughter had accused her of being irresponsible with her inheritance, money that was supposedly being preserved for the next generation rather than squandered on frivolous travel. Dorothy's son had expressed concern about her mental state, suggesting that a year-long cruise was evidence of some kind of breakdown that required intervention. Frank's children had questioned his ability to manage his own affairs at 72, hinting that extended travel might indicate early cognitive decline. The patterns were identical to what I'd experienced with Emma and David. Adult children who'd grown comfortable treating their parents as resources rather than individuals with their own desires and autonomy. The sense of entitlement masked as concern, the emotional manipulation disguised as love, the assumption that aging parents existed primarily to serve the next generation's convenience. Our first port of call was Barbados, and stepping off the ship onto foreign soil felt like a rebirth. The tropical air, the brilliant colors of the Caribbean architecture, the sounds and smells of a culture completely different from suburban Minneapolis, created a sensory awakening I hadn't anticipated. Margaret and I explored the capital city of Bridgetown together, marveling at the British colonial architecture and sampling local cuisine that expanded our understanding of what food could be. That evening, as we sailed toward our next destination, I called Tyler from the ship's communications center to check on my house. His report was exactly what I'd hoped for. Everything was secure, the neighbors were keeping an eye on things, and my mail was being handled efficiently. But more importantly, he shared that Emma had stopped by to ask for my contact information, not to pressure me about returning early, but to share news about Mason's progress in swimming lessons and to ask about sending photos from my travels. The transformation in my family's attitude toward my cruise had continued after my departure. Without the immediate pressure of childcare demands, Emma and David had been forced to develop their own solutions, and according to Tyler, both were discovering that independent problem-solving was more empowering than they'd expected. Emma had enrolled Mason and Lily in a weekend enrichment program that provided both educational activities and childcare, funded by reducing her own discretionary spending, rather than expecting me to subsidize their lifestyle through free services. David and Jennifer had worked out a schedule where he reduced his weekend overtime hours to provide childcare while she attended study groups, a solution that strengthened their marriage by requiring shared sacrifice rather than imposing costs on external family members. As we sailed through the Caribbean toward the Panama Canal, I began documenting my experiences in a journal that quickly evolved into letters home. Not guilt-inducing reports about my abandonment of family responsibilities, but genuine sharing of discoveries and adventures with people I loved. The postcards I mailed from each port were met with enthusiasm from my grandchildren, who'd begun tracking my journey on a world map in their bedrooms. The Panama Canal transit was an engineering marvel that reminded me why I'd wanted to travel in the first place. Watching massive container ships navigate the locks alongside our cruise ship, learning about the history and construction of this incredible feat of human ingenuity, feeling connected to global commerce and international cooperation in ways that transcended my small-town Minnesota experience. Margaret and I spent hours on deck during the canal passage, talking about the decades we'd spent focused on local concerns, while an entire world of wonder existed beyond our daily routines. The perspective shift was profound, not just geographically but psychologically. Problems that had seemed overwhelming in Minneapolis looked manageable from the deck of a ship crossing between oceans. Our first Pacific port was Puerto Vallarta, Mexico, where the combination of mountainous landscape and ocean views created vistas unlike anything I'd experienced. Dorothy joined Margaret and me for a cooking class where we learned to prepare authentic Mexican cuisine using ingredients and techniques that challenged everything we thought we knew about food preparation. The instructor was a grandmother named Carmen, whose own children lived in California and rarely visited. She spoke about the loneliness of aging parents whose adult children were too busy with their own lives to maintain meaningful connections, except when they needed childcare or financial assistance. The conversation reminded me how common my experience had been, and how unusual my solution was. Most of the grandmothers Carmen knew had simply accepted their fate as unpaid childcare providers, sacrificing their own dreams to accommodate their children's convenience. The cultural expectation that aging parents should be grateful for the opportunity to serve the next generation was so pervasive that questioning it felt revolutionary. As we sailed across the Pacific toward French Polynesia, I began receiving emails from Emma that revealed the positive changes occurring in her life. Without the crutch of weekend childcare from me, she'd been forced to develop better time management skills and more realistic expectations about work-life balance. Marcus had reduced his travel schedule after recognizing that his frequent absences were contributing to Emma's stress and dependence on external help. Most significantly, Emma had begun pursuing interests she'd abandoned after becoming a mother. She'd enrolled in a photography class that met on weekends, using the same time she'd previously expected me to fill with childcare responsibilities. The independence she'd been forced to develop was revealing capabilities she'd forgotten she possessed. David's updates, forwarded through Tyler, were equally encouraging. Jennifer's nursing school success had inspired him to consider his own educational goals, and he'd applied for a business management program that would improve his earning potential while providing more flexible scheduling. The crisis created by my unavailability had forced them to examine their life choices and make improvements they'd been avoiding. Tahiti exceeded every expectation I'd harbored about tropical paradise. The water was impossibly blue, the mountains were draped in emerald vegetation, and the Polynesian culture offered insights into community structures that prioritized collective well-being over individual accumulation. Margaret, Dorothy, Frank and I spent 3 days exploring different islands, each offering unique perspectives on how human societies could organize themselves around different values. The contrast with American culture was striking. In Polynesian tradition, elders were revered for their wisdom and experience rather than viewed as burdens or resources to be utilized. Multi-generational families lived together by choice rather than necessity, with clear roles and mutual respect governing relationships. The idea of adult children demanding services from their parents while offering nothing in return would have been incomprehensible. During our evening discussions on deck, fellow passengers shared stories about cultural differences they'd observed in family structures around the world. The American pattern of adult children treating their parents as available servants appeared to be relatively unique, driven by economic pressures and cultural individualism that prioritized personal convenience over family harmony. Our passage to New Zealand required 10 days at sea, providing opportunities for shipboard lectures and activities that enriched my understanding of the places we'd visit. Marine biologists spoke about ocean ecosystems, historians provided context about colonial influences in the Pacific, and anthropologists shared insights about indigenous cultures we'd encounter. But the most valuable education occurred during informal conversations with fellow passengers who'd made similar life choices. A retired engineer named Robert shared how his decision to take a solo sailing trip around the world had initially horrified his children, but ultimately inspired them to pursue their own delayed dreams. A former teacher named Linda described how her year in European art museums had led to a second career as a gallery curator, after her children accused her of being selfish for spending her inheritance on travel rather than leaving it untouched for them. The common thread in all these stories was transformation. Not just the personal growth that came from new experiences, but the positive changes that occurred in family relationships when aging parents stopped enabling their adult children's dependency and started modeling independence and self-fulfillment. Auckland, New Zealand, welcomed us with stunning harbor views and a culture that blended European influences with Maori traditions in fascinating ways. The city's commitment to environmental sustainability and outdoor recreation reminded me of values I'd held but hadn't prioritized during my years focused on family obligations and career demands. Margaret and I took a multi-day excursion to Rotorua, where geothermal features created landscapes that seemed otherworldly. The Maori cultural performances we attended emphasized respect for elders and the wisdom that comes with age, presenting a stark contrast to American attitudes that often dismissed older adults as irrelevant or burdensome. During our time in New Zealand, I received a phone call that crystallized how much had changed in my family dynamics. Emma called not with demands or guilt-inducing pressure, but with genuine excitement about her photography progress and gratitude for the independence my absence had forced her to develop. "Mom, I have to tell you something that's hard to admit," she said, her voice carrying humility I hadn't heard since she was a teenager. Acknowledging a mistake, I realize now that depending on you for weekend childcare was keeping me from growing as a person. Having to solve my own problems has made me more confident and capable than I've felt in years. The transformation in Emma's perspective was remarkable. Instead of viewing my cruise as abandonment, she'd begun to see it as a gift that had forced her to discover her own strength and resourcefulness. The children were thriving with the additional structure and independence, and her marriage had improved once she'd stopped using me as an escape valve for her parenting responsibilities. David's evolution was equally significant. Jennifer reported that he'd initially been angry and resentful about having to find alternative childcare arrangements, but had gradually recognized that overdependence on my services had prevented him from developing his own parenting skills and work-life balance strategies. Australia welcomed us with cosmopolitan cities and landscapes unlike anywhere else on Earth. Sydney's harbour was breathtaking, Melbourne's cultural scene was sophisticated, and the outback revealed the raw beauty of a continent shaped by millions of years of unique evolution. But the most meaningful experience occurred during a conversation with an Aboriginal elder who shared traditional perspectives on aging and wisdom. In her culture, older adults were considered repositories of knowledge and experience, consulted for guidance rather than expected to provide services. The idea of grandparents as unpaid childcare workers would have been deeply offensive to traditional values that honored elders' contributions to community well-being. The conversation reinforced insights I'd been developing throughout my journey. American culture's treatment of aging parents as available resources rather than respected individuals wasn't universal or inevitable. Other societies had developed structures that honored older adults' autonomy while maintaining strong family connections based on mutual respect rather than one-sided service. As we sailed from Australia toward Asia, I began planning the final stages of my year-long journey with a sense of profound personal transformation. The experiences I'd accumulated, the relationships I'd formed with fellow passengers, and the perspectives I'd gained about family dynamics had fundamentally changed my understanding of what my life could become. The emails I exchanged with Tyler revealed continued positive developments at home. Emma had expanded her photography interests into a small business, selling prints at local art fairs and earning income that provided both financial independence and creative fulfillment. David had been accepted into the business management program and was preparing for coursework that would begin after my return. Most remarkably, both of my children had begun planning their own travel adventures, inspired by the photos and stories I'd shared throughout my cruise. Emma was organizing a weekend trip to Chicago with Marcus, their first vacation alone together since Mason was born. David and Jennifer were saving for an anniversary trip to Europe, using budgeting skills they'd developed while managing their childcare needs independently. Singapore's blend of Eastern and Western cultures provided insights into how modern societies could maintain traditional values while embracing global perspectives. The city-state's efficient public systems and multicultural harmony offered models for community organization that prioritized collective well-being without sacrificing individual opportunity. During my time in Singapore, I received an unexpected email from Linda, my sister, who'd been following my journey through social media posts and family updates. Her message revealed that my decision to take the cruise had inspired her own reassessment of retirement goals and family relationships. "Sarah, watching your adventure has made me realize I've been postponing my own dreams while waiting for adult children to need less support. I've decided to sell my house and move to that cottage in Maine we always talked about. Thank you for showing me that it's possible to prioritize our own happiness without destroying family relationships. The ripple effects of my decision to establish boundaries and pursue my own interests were extending beyond my immediate family. Linda's courage to make her own life changes suggested that my example was encouraging other women in our generation to reconsider their assumptions about aging and autonomy. Bangkok, Thailand, challenged every assumption I'd held about urban life in developing countries. The city's vibrant street food culture, magnificent temples, and bustling markets created sensory experiences that expanded my understanding of how human communities could function. The Buddhist emphasis on individual responsibility for personal happiness resonated deeply with insights I'd been developing about family dynamics and self-determination. A conversation with a Thai grandmother revealed cultural perspectives that contrasted sharply with American expectations about aging parents. In traditional Thai culture, adult children were expected to care for elderly parents, but this care was reciprocal rather than exploitative. Grandparents provided wisdom and cultural continuity while receiving respect and support, creating interdependence rather than one-sided service relationships. The contrast with Emma and David's original expectations was striking. They'd assumed I would provide childcare services while offering nothing in return, except the supposed privilege of spending time with my grandchildren. The relationship had been extractive rather than reciprocal, designed for their benefit rather than mutual support. As we sailed through the Indian Ocean toward India, I reflected on the year's experiences and their impact on my understanding of family, independence, and aging. The cruise had provided more than travel experiences and cultural education. It had offered proof that prioritizing my own happiness hadn't destroyed my family relationships, but had actually improved them by forcing everyone to develop healthier patterns of interdependence. Mumbai, India, presented contrasts between poverty and wealth, tradition and modernity, that challenged simplistic assumptions about economic development and social progress. The city's energy was overwhelming but exhilarating, offering perspectives on human resilience and community cooperation that informed my growing understanding of how families could function more effectively. During a tour of local neighborhoods, I observed multi-generational families living together by choice rather than economic necessity, with clear roles and mutual responsibilities that benefited everyone involved. Grandparents weren't expected to provide free childcare, but were respected for their contributions to family wisdom and cultural continuity. The contrast with American family dynamics was profound. In the families I observed, aging parents were valued for their experience and consulted for guidance rather than treated as available servants expected to accommodate younger generations' convenience without reciprocation or appreciation. Our passage through the Suez Canal marked the transition from Eastern to Western experiences, but the psychological journey had been equally significant. I was returning to familiar cultural contexts with fundamentally changed perspectives on aging, independence, and family relationships. Egypt's ancient monuments reminded me that human civilizations had always grappled with questions about individual fulfillment versus collective responsibility. The pyramids and temples we visited had been built by societies that understood the importance of honoring different life stages while maintaining community cohesion. As we sailed through the Mediterranean toward European destinations, I began planning my eventual return to Minneapolis with excitement rather than dread. The year-long journey had proven that establishing boundaries and prioritizing personal happiness could coexist with loving family relationships based on mutual respect rather than one-sided service. Rome, Barcelona, and the French Riviera provided culminating experiences that reinforced insights developed throughout the cruise. European attitudes toward aging and family relationships offered models for respecting individual autonomy while maintaining strong community connections. The final weeks of the cruise included transatlantic passage back toward Fort Lauderdale, providing time for reflection and planning. The relationships I'd formed with fellow passengers had evolved into lasting friendships based on shared values about independence and self-determination. We'd proven that pursuing personal dreams didn't require abandoning family responsibilities, but could actually strengthen relationships by demonstrating healthy boundaries and mutual respect. As the ship approached Fort Lauderdale, after a full year at sea, I felt anticipation about reuniting with my family, confidence about maintaining the boundaries I'd established, and excitement about continuing the life I'd designed for myself, rather than the one others had expected me to accept. The transformation had been complete. I was no longer a resource to be utilized, but a person whose own interests and happiness mattered as much as anyone else's convenience. The year-long cruise had provided adventures beyond my wildest dreams, but more importantly, it had given me back ownership of my own life. Tyler was waiting at the port with Helen and several neighbors, their faces reflecting genuine excitement about my return, rather than resentment about my absence. The welcome committee included Emma and David, with all 4 grandchildren, who rushed toward me with enthusiasm untainted by manipulation or guilt. The hugs I received felt different than before my departure, warmer and more genuine, because they came from people who'd learned to value my presence, rather than take it for granted. Emma's first words captured the transformation that had occurred in our relationship. "Mom, we missed you so much, but watching your adventure inspired all of us to become more independent and confident. Thank you for showing us what's possible when we stop making excuses and start pursuing our own dreams." The homecoming celebration felt like a new beginning, rather than a return to old patterns. My family had learned to function without exploiting my generosity, and I'd proven to myself that prioritizing my own happiness could coexist with loving relationships, based on mutual respect, rather than one-sided service. Standing in my garden that evening, surrounded by neighbors and family members who were eager to hear about my adventures, without demanding that I resume providing free childcare services, I understood that the real journey had just begun. The cruise had been preparation for a life designed around my own values and interests, rather than other people's expectations and demands. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories, right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.